So, have you ever wondered why the church felt the need to change the Latin Mass after the Second Vatican Council? If so, stick around to find out why. Okay, so why did the church at the Second Vatican Council feel the need to make some changes to what's called the Latin Mass, the Roman Rite as it was expressed at the Council of Trent? Well, many reasons why, and we're going to take a look at a few of them, not only according to the council, but also according to a message of Pope Paul VI, who was one of the popes at the Second Vatican Council. I say one because the first one at the Second Vatican Council died during the council. And so Pope Paul VI was elected and he finished the council. And then he promulgates several years later the new missal of the Roman Rite that is currently being celebrated in the Roman Rite in what's commonly called the Novus Ordo in its most recent form in the third edition of this missal. And he gave I believe it was a general audience. Yeah, it's a general audience, 1969, to kind of prepare people for the Novus Ordo. And he explains to them why this is happening. And so we're going to take a look at it because he goes over some reasons to make some adjustments here to the Roman Rite. Now, of course, if you read the Second Vatican Council in its document Sacrosanctum Concilium, it is entirely devoted to the question of reforming the Roman Rite. And perhaps we'll go through that at some time. It's a pretty lengthy document, so I'm not going to go over it in any kind of detail. In fact, I'm only going to read to you one paragraph from that document, and then I'm going to rely mostly on that general audience from Pope Paul VI. But for people who are kind of new to this question and they're grappling with the issue of, why did the church feel the need to modify the liturgy? And hey, what was wrong with the Latin Mass? Isn't the Latin Mass a very beautiful liturgy? Why change that? Certainly, the Latin Mass is a very, very beautiful liturgy. I personally think it's an incredible liturgy, an incredible form of the Roman Rite. I appreciate and value all of the liturgies of the Catholic Church, but I do have a great deal of respect and appreciation for the Roman Rite, especially in its 1962 edition, the Missal of 1962, what's often called the Latin Mass. That being said, there were reasons to modify it, and we need to explore some of those reasons. But don't let this give you the impression that there's something wrong with the Latin Mass, as it's called. No, it's absolutely beautiful liturgy. And the Council Fathers did not feel that there was something wrong or evil or bad about the Roman Rite as it was being celebrated in the Latin Mass, but rather they wanted to address some situations where there had been some innovations that crept into the Latin Mass that no longer held the significance that they did at the time of those innovations. And so they wanted to restore some of those elements, especially some of the apostolic elements that liturgy had departed from over time for various reasons, and good reasons, mind you. And there's a lot of other reasons involved. We're going to explore some of those, but that's one of them. For those who may not be familiar with a study of liturgy, the Roman Rite is one of many liturgies in the Catholic Church and throughout history. You have the Roman Rite being established around the 4th century. Prior to then, there wasn't a Roman Rite per se. You really just have um, local liturgies being celebrated in various kinds of ways. In fact, because the liturgy wasn't really standardized, until you start to get to the fourth and fifth century, you start to get these standardized liturgies, including the Roman Rite. Prior to then, they were less standardized. And so you could see a lot of variation, a lot of changes, just depending on where you go, where you were. One example of many would be the readings of scripture during the liturgy. Sometimes, there wasn't a set reading. It was rather, at one point in very early church history, the local bishop would just say, okay, start reading from scripture. And the person would read from scripture to the entire congregation until the bishop just said stop. And so it would be a little different just depending on where you were, because a lot of things were not being standardized. So the standardization of the liturgy comes much, much later. In fact, the Eucharistic prayers, where the priest prays over the elements, the Eucharistic prayer, the canon, he prays over the bread and wine, and they become the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ. Well, the canon, that you find in the Roman Rite, it developed over time, and you don't have a specific canon, or at least just one particular one, until much later. There would be various versions of the Roman Rite canons, and you would even have celebrants making up a canon as they go in many cases. So you can imagine, early on, with the fervor of the early Christians, I suppose it'd be pretty easy for a priest to kind of make up the canon as he goes, because they are just so filled with the Holy Spirit, and things are so fresh for them. But as time began to progress, some of that, I suppose, wore off, and it became necessary for them to kind of standardize the canon and have something written out, where they would go ahead and read from something pre-written rather than make it up on the spot. And certainly in some cases with some priests today, I suppose that's a good thing, right? We wouldn't necessarily want them making up canons. No offense to some priests who may be watching. There may be some priests who can make up great canons on the spot, but then again, there may be some others that it's like, yeah, this is why we have a prescribed text. In fact, in some cases, there wasn't even the words of institution in some liturgies. In fact, one of the very oldest liturgies that we have that has lasted unto this day does not have the words of institution. You might say the substance of them is kind of scattered throughout the entire liturgy, but there is no moment where, the priest says, this is my body and this is my blood. There is no, formal place where there is this words of institution, which is pretty shocking to people, because at the Council of Trent, that's considered essential for transubstantiation. And there's, of course, ways in which the Catholic Church understands this, but the point is, you can see there's so much variation that in some liturgies they didn't even have the words of institution. Early liturgies also would take place in the context of a meal, an agape meal, whereas you get past the second and third century, that becomes pretty uncommon and unpopular. But early on, it was taking place in the context of a meal. In early liturgies, you also would often have an incorporation of charismatic gifts by various participants. One person speaks in tongues, one person prophesies, and so on. You can see that mentioned in 1 Corinthians 14. That pretty quickly began to subside, but really early on you have that. And so the point that I'm making here is, you didn't have a standardized liturgy very early on, and there were all sorts of things taking place. Let me briefly just mention a few changes that have taken place to the Roman Rite, just so that we have some perspective here whenever we're talking about the Roman Rite and why alter things to the Latin Mass. I just want to make it very clear, it is not the case that the Latin Mass was always the way that it was. That's just simply not it. In fact, the Roman Rite, the liturgies in Rome originally were in Greek, not in Latin. So you couldn't even speak of a Latin Mass in the 2nd or 3rd century. You start to get maybe Latin liturgies in Rome in the 3rd century, only because that was the vernacular. So early on, liturgies really valued the vernacular, whatever language was spoken by people at the time. That was very important so that they could understand and participate in the liturgy. Whenever Greek became a little less common, especially in Rome, you start to have Latin being introduced because that was the vernacular, not because somehow it was a special language, but because that's what most people spoke. And so you start to have Latin in the Roman Rite. But eventually it got to a point where, most people didn't speak Latin. So there was an abandonment, at least in the Roman Rite, of the vernacular. And many of the Eastern liturgies still preserved that tradition of the vernacular, but the Roman Rite effectively abandoned that tradition. So you have a departure here from something that is apostolic, and that is the practice of using the vernacular. And so we can start to see the Roman Rite departing from some apostolic practices for various reasons. Another apostolic practice that the Roman Rite departed from was communion under both kinds. That was abandoned. That was apostolic in nature, to give people the body, blood, soul, and divinity under both kinds. Whereas over a period of time, for various reasons, the laity were given only the Eucharist under one kind. And in fact, at some point, they were no longer given, the laity were no longer given communion during the liturgy itself, during the Mass. So if they were going to receive, it would be done outside of the Mass. And so there's a lot of changes that were made to the Roman Rite, and this is all well before the Second Vatican Council. And again, I say all this just so that we're aware that there have been many, many changes. So we can't speak of a Mass of the ages. There really is no such thing. There are many different Masses, and I don't suppose that you could say any of them are really a Mass of the ages, given how many changes there have been made to all of the liturgies, and how all of them have some significant departures from some apostolic practices. So communion in the hand was another apostolic practice that was eventually abandoned in the Roman Rite towards the end of the first millennium. For about 1,000 years, you have a dominance of communion in the hand in the Roman Rite, but eventually that was abandoned for various reasons. You also had the use of leavened bread that was very prevalent in the West. That was eventually abandoned, and you had the phenomenon of unleavened bread being used for the liturgy. Confirmation of infants was something that was done in the apostolic period and in the early church, still done in the Eastern liturgies, whereas the Roman Rite departed from that and stopped confirming infants for various reasons. Infant communion is another one that's apostolic, still there in the Eastern liturgies. Roman Rite, for various reasons, abandoned that practice and stopped giving communion to infants. That's more in the second millennium where that happens. But over time, there was also less focus on participation of the faithful in the Roman Rite. In the early liturgies, there was a great deal of emphasis on participation of the faithful. But when you get to a point where the liturgy is no longer in the vernacular in the Roman Rite, you're going to obviously have less participation from the faithful. And that's why you end up having parts from the Latin Mass that repeat themselves, where the priest will say one part and then the server says the part as well. And the reason that developed is because the server was saying the part of the congregation. So there was less participation on part of the people because they no longer spoke Latin. They don't have missals. A lot of them couldn't read. Those who could, there wasn't any kind of standardized, missal that they had access to or anything like that. So it was pretty difficult for them to follow along. And so over time, you have people praying their rosary and doing private devotions like that during the liturgy. And hey, there's nothing wrong with the rosary. Rosary's awesome. Those private devotions are great and time honored. However, the time and place it's not the most fitting because um, during the liturgy, there needs to be more active participation in the liturgy, and we can pray the rosary outside of the liturgy. The liturgy is the greatest prayer of the church, and the rosary is going to be secondary to that. Actually, it's tertiary. Secondary would be the liturgy of the hours, according to the Catholic Church. So, private devotions and stuff like that, as good as they are, they eventually kind of took the place of the laity, and that wasn't as ideal. It's not like this is evil or this is sinful or this is bad, but rather that's not ideal. So a lot of these departures, a lot of these things that took place in the Roman Rite, they're not evil, they're not sinful, they're not bad, but rather they also aren't ideal. And the Council Fathers at Vatican II recognized that, and they realized, okay, in some of these cases, we need to restore some of these practices. That the Roman Rite had abandoned for various reasons. So I also want to mention one more here. I have Fortescue, Adrian Fortescue's book in front of me, The Mass, A Study of the Roman Liturgy. Recommend everybody reads it. But here he talks about how the Roman canon was significantly changed. A lot of people think that is the essence of the Roman Rite, the Roman canon, what's now called a Roman canon or prayer, Eucharistic prayer number 1 in the Novus Ordo. And certainly it is very much time honored in many ways, but there have been many changes to that canon over the ages. And some people have felt like the canon is the central aspect to the Latin Mass. Well, if that's the case, there's plenty of instances where the canon is being shortened and changed. In fact, let me read this from Fortescue. He says, "It may be taken as certain and admitted on all sides that our canon," and he's talking about the Roman canon, as it is in the Latin Mass, "is not now in the form in which it was first composed. It is a rearrangement and almost certainly a fragment." So it's a lot shorter than how it was in some generations prior to this kind of truncated version that we end up finding. And that's relatively common. A lot of the liturgies became shortened. Some of the liturgies were taking place for 3 or 4 hours. And so both in East and West, some of these liturgies were shortened over time. And the Roman canon was also shortened. And one last point before we dive into what Paul VI says. I do want to point out that when it comes to the Latin Mass, when we speak of it as the Missal of the Council of Trent or the Tridentine liturgy, do keep in mind that the liturgy that was promulgated after the time of the Council of Trent, because it wasn't the Council of Trent itself that promulgated it, it was actually a Pope Pius V, after the council, who promulgated that liturgy. Well, that liturgy is not the exact same liturgy that you find being celebrated as a Latin Mass today. In fact, there's many changes. There's a great deal of changes from the time of the Tridentine Mass until the Latin Mass that most people celebrate either today in the 55 edition or 1962 edition. There's a lot of changes in that period of time from the Council of Trent until, the Second Vatican Council. A lot of changes being made. One in particular is, again, there's this point where at the time of the Tridentine liturgy, the faithful were not receiving the Eucharist during the liturgy. And so there was a part that had to be added to the Tridentine liturgy that introduced or reintroduced communion for the faithful during the liturgy. And there have been many other changes that have been made. And so it's hard to speak of a Mass of the Ages or to see the Latin Mass as always being in one particular way. That's just simply not the case for really any of our liturgies. However, I do want to say all of our liturgies are awesome. I love them, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're untouched and have always been done a particular way up until the Second Vatican Council. That is just not true. In fact, one more point, the changes that were made to the Roman Rite between the Second Vatican Council, or prior to the Second Vatican Council with the Latin Mass, and after the Second Vatican Council with the Novus Ordo, those changes are less than the changes that have really occurred between a first century liturgy, perhaps one taking place in Rome, compared to a fourth century liturgy in Rome. There's more changes in those first 400 years than there was between the Latin Mass and the Novus Ordo. So keep that in mind. Okay, having said all that, I hope that I've now kind of given some context for how the liturgy has in some ways changed over time. And by the way, that was not exhaustive. There's a lot of other stuff that I could say. That's just mostly stuff from the top of my head. Let me read to you from the Second Vatican Council what it says in its first document when it goes to undertake this question of reforming the liturgy. It says this: this sacred council has several aims in view. It desires to impart an ever-increasing vigor to the Christian life of the faithful, to adapt more suitably to the needs of our own times those institutions which are subject to change. So keep that in mind. There are some aspects to the liturgy that can change. There's some aspects that cannot change. What are the aspects that can't change? Well, the substance of the sacrament itself. So you can't swap out bread and wine for Doritos and Pepsi. You know, that is set in stone. But a lot of the other things surrounding the liturgy are adaptable and have adapted to the times. I mean, numerous cases throughout history. Let me just briefly bring up here Fortescue, who briefly mentions this. He says, "We have now arrived at the early Middle Ages. From this time forward, there is little chronicle of the nature of change in the order of the Mass itself. That has now become a sacred and inviolable inheritance, its origin forgotten. It will be popularly believed to date unchanged from the apostles." So even at that time in the early Middle Ages, there were some people who thought that the Roman Rite was always that way and that it actually went back to the apostles like that, kind of like some people today believe that, or to have been written by St. Peter himself. But there are developments of another kind to notice. As the Roman liturgy entered into sole possession of the West, the manner of using it adapted itself to the times, and then came the later derived rites. So he talks about how even then in the early Middle Ages, the Roman liturgy was adapting itself to the times. This is something that just happens with liturgies, and it needs to happen. In some of those areas that are subject to change, there's nothing wrong with it adapting to the times if it is suitable for the salvation of souls. And it's ultimately up to the judgment of the church to do that, not up to my personal opinion. And that's according to the Council of Trent, that the church has this authority and the Pope has this authority. So what are they wanting to do? They want to adapt more suitably to the need of our own times, those institutions which are subject to change, to foster whatever can promote union among all who believe in Christ. So in some way, are there some ways that we can modify the liturgy that can promote union with other Christians? Not in any way that changes the liturgy in a negative way, but rather in a way that can foster unity. to strengthen whatever can help or to call the whole of mankind into the household of the church. How can we strengthen the salvation of souls and bringing lost souls into the church? The council therefore sees particularly cogent reasons for undertaking the reform and promotion of the liturgy. And towards the end it says the council also desires that where necessary, the rites be revised carefully in the light of sound tradition, and that they be given a new vigor to meet the circumstances and needs of modern times. And don't let that cause concern. Don't think, oh, this is modernism. No, the church has always done this. It has always adapted itself to the modern times, not in a way that changes the substance of the faith or abandons the dogmas, rather in a way that takes those same unchanging dogmas and applies them effectively in the most strategic and evangelistic way. That is what is meant by adapting to the needs of modern times. And again, we have 2,000 years of not just the Roman Rite doing this, but really all of the liturgies that exist in the church today. All of them have done this. And so really this is not anything new that the Second Vatican Council was doing, but that's the intention. Now, whether or not the reform of the liturgy has been successful, and whether or not it has effectively done these things that we just read, that's a different question. That's a different debate. That's a different show. Whether or not we've executed that successfully, that's debatable. In some parts of the world, maybe. In other parts, maybe not. That's a different show, though. Today, I just wanted to go over, well, here's what their intention was. And also, here's what Paul VI says. And this is November 19th, 1969. He says, "Our dear sons and daughters, we wish to draw your attention to an event about to occur in the Latin Catholic Church, the introduction of the liturgy of the new rite of the Mass." And that's certainly an imprecise use of the term, because as Benedict notes, the Latin Mass and the Novus Ordo are the same Roman rite. They're not two different rites. But he's using this in a very loose way. It will become obligatory in Italian dioceses from first Sunday of Advent, which this year falls on November 30th. The Mass will be celebrated in a rather different manner from that in which we have been accustomed to celebrate it in the last 4 centuries, from the reign of Pius V after the Council of Trent down to the present. This change has something astonishing about it, something extraordinary. This is because the Mass is regarded as the traditional and untouchable expression of our religious worship and the authenticity of our faith. We ask ourselves, how could such a change be made? What effect will it have on those who attend Holy Mass? Answers will be given to these questions and others like them arising from this innovation. You will hear the answers in all the churches. They will be amply repeated there and in all religious publications, in all schools where Christian doctrine is taught. We exhort you to pay attention to them, and that way you will be able to get a clearer and deeper idea of the stupendous and mysterious notion of the Mass. But in this brief and simple discourse, we will try only to relieve your minds of the first spontaneous difficulties which this change arouses. We will do so in relation to the first 3 questions which immediately occur to mind because of it. How can such a change be made? Answer: it is due to the will expressed by the Ecumenical Council not long ago. A good 2,500 bishops, largest ecumenical council ever, was in favor of modifying the liturgy. The council decreed, the rite of the Mass is to be revised in such a way that the intrinsic nature and purpose of its several parts, also the connection between them, can be more clearly manifested. And these 2 parts, especially that we're talking about, are several parts here, is going to be the liturgy of the Word, liturgy of the Eucharist, and that devout and active participation by the faithful can be more easily accomplished. This was a big thing, is kind of getting the laity more actively involved in participating directly in the liturgy, not just focusing on praying the rosary, but focusing on praying the prayers of the liturgy while the liturgy is going on. That was the original intention of the liturgy. That was the original practice, still preserved in many of the Eastern churches. But the Roman Rite had over time departed from that practice for multiple reasons. And the Council Fathers recognized, well, we need to restore this notion of active participation, because for the laity to be less involved like this is certainly not ideal. For this purpose, the rites are to be simplified, while due care is taken to preserve their substance. Now, this has happened over and over throughout the history of many liturgies, including the Roman Rite. We've seen, again, I just mentioned the canon, how it was simplified in the early church and early medieval period. Elements which, with the passage of time, came to be duplicated. So you have the server saying the part of the faithful, and so you have a duplication there. Or were added with but little advantage, are now to be discarded. Where opportunity allows or necessity demands, other elements which have suffered injury through accidents of history are now to be restored to the earlier norm of the fathers. So a perfect example of this is the restoration of the chalice to the laity, so that the laity can receive communion under both kinds. Not that it's essential. I mean, they receive the full body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ, even if you receive under one kind, but that wasn't the ideal. That wasn't the original intention. The original intention was to receive under both kinds, because that better expresses what one is already receiving. So many other reasons. So the Council Fathers wanted to restore some of these practices that had been lost over time. The reform which is about to be brought into being is therefore a response to an authoritative mandate from the church. It's an act of obedience. It's an act of coherence of the church with herself. It's a step forward for her authentic tradition. It is a demonstration of fidelity and vitality to which we must all give prompt assent. So if you have somebody in the church today who's not on board with the liturgical reforms, we're not talking about people who just appreciate and value and maybe even prefer the Latin Mass. We're talking about people who are just not on board with reforming the liturgy. There's a problem there. There's certainly an issue. They need more catechesis. They have a deficient understanding of the Roman Rite, and they also have a deficient understanding of Catholic authority. And this is what this is talking about here. It's necessary for us to understand their needs for the reform and to accept them. We can't be in this limbo phase where we just try to hide out at the Latin Mass and just kind of ignore that the church is wanting us to embrace reforms to the Roman Rite. We can't be in that weird limbo phase, because what we're doing is we're stalling and we're holding off, and we're putting on hold a bigger issue, and that is our obedience to the church and our recognition of its authority. It is not an arbitrary act. It is not a transitory or optional experiment. It is not some improvisation. It's a law. It has been thought out by authoritative experts of sacred liturgy. It has been discussed and meditated upon for a long time. And some people say, well, you know, there is this person who was part of the commission and they were this and that. And I just think in the back of my mind, they would be horrified if they read the Acts of the ecumenical councils in the first millennium and they saw how the hot dog was made there, how the sausage was made, how some of these ecumenical councils were done, some of the characters there. They'd be horrified. If you think the process for the reform of the liturgy was rough in some ways, you don't want to read the Acts of the Fourth Ecumenical Council or the Third Ecumenical Council or the Fifth Ecumenical Council. You don't want to read those. It'll make your stomach turn. We shall do well to accept it with joyful interest and put it into practice punctually, unanimously, and carefully. This reform puts an end to uncertainties, to discussions, to arbitrary abuses. It calls us back to that uniformity of rights and feeling proper to the Catholic Church, the heir and continuation of that first Christian community, which was all one single heart and single soul. The choral character of the Church's prayer is one of the strengths of her unity and her Catholicity. The change about to be made must not break up that choral character or disturb it. It ought to confirm it and make it resound with a new spirit, the spirit of her youth. The second question is, what exactly are the changes? He says, you will see for yourselves that they consist of many new directions for celebrating the rites. Especially at the beginning, these will call for a certain amount of attention and care. Personal devotion and community sense will make it easy and pleasant to observe these new rules, but keep this clearly in mind. Nothing has been changed of the substance of our traditional Mass. But you know what? There's a lot of people who just don't believe that today. And that's a problem. This is where they need more catechesis. Because what Paul VI is saying is correct. St. Paul VI is correct. The substance has not changed. Perhaps some may allow themselves to be carried away by the impression made by some particular ceremony or additional rubric, and thus think that they conceal some alteration or diminution of truths which were acquired by the Catholic faith forever and are sanctioned by it. They might come to believe that the equation between the law of prayer, lex orandi, and the law of faith, lex credendi, is compromised as a result. It is not so, absolutely not. Above all, because the rite and the relative rubric are not in themselves a dogmatic definition. So he's noting that there are some things that are part of the liturgy that are not definitive in nature. They're disciplinary and they're subject to change according to the mind of the church. Now, there's obviously some things that are dogmatic in nature. Those can't change. So if we were to say that Jesus isn't really present in the Eucharist, okay, that's a denial of a dogma. You can't do that. So you can't have something in the liturgy that denies that Jesus is truly present in the Eucharist. You can't have that. Their theological qualification may vary in different degrees according to the liturgical context to which they refer. They are gestures and terms relating to a religious action experienced in living, of an indescribable mystery of divine presence, not always expressed in a universal way. Only theological criticism can analyze this action and express it in logically satisfying doctrinal formulas. The Mass of the New Rite is and remains the same Mass we have always had. You know who else said that? Pope Benedict XVI in Summorum Pontificum. Yep. He says that too. It's the same Mass. It's the same Roman Rite. Because if you think this isn't the Roman Rite because of these changes, oh boy, you're in for a surprise, because there's been more changes from the 4th century until the time of the Council of Trent than between 1962 and 1969 to the Roman liturgy. He says, if anything, its sameness has been brought out more clearly in some respects. And I would say, yes, in some respects. The unity of the Lord's Supper, that's what Scripture calls it, of the sacrifice of the cross, on the cross, of the representation and the renewal of both in the Mass, is inviolably affirmed and celebrated in the new rite, just as they were in the old. The Mass is and remains the memorial of Christ's Last Supper. At that supper, the Lord changed the bread and wine into his body and blood and instituted the sacrifice of the New Testament. He willed that the sacrifice should be identically renewed by the power of his priesthood, conferred on the apostles. You know, don't let people who say, oh, that the new Mass somehow denies the sacrificial nature. Not at all. Not at all. And in fact, every Novus Ordo has a reference to the sacrifice of the Mass in it, every single one of them. Doesn't matter what variation, every single one of them has reference to it. Only the manner of offering is different, namely an unbloody and sacramental manner, and it is offered in perennial memory of himself until his final return. In the new rite, you will find the relationship between the liturgy of the Word and the liturgy of the Eucharist, strictly so-called, brought out more clearly, as if the latter were the practical response to the former. You will find how much the assembly of the faithful is called upon to participate in the celebration of the Eucharistic sacrifice, and how in the Mass they are and fully feel themselves the church. You will also see other marvelous features of our Mass, but do not think that these things are aimed at altering its genuine and traditional essence. Rather, try to see how the Church desires to give greater efficacy to her liturgical message through this new and more expansive liturgical language. How she wishes to bring home the message to each of her faithful and to the whole body of the people of God in a more direct and pastoral way. In the like manner, we reply to the third question. What will be the results of this innovation? The results expected, or rather desired, are that the faithful will participate in the liturgical mystery with more understanding, in a more practical and more enjoyable and a more sanctifying way. That is, they will hear the word of God, which lives and echoes down the centuries in our individual souls. And they will likewise share in the mystical reality of Christ's sacramental and propitiatory sacrifice. So do not let us talk about the new Mass. Let us rather speak of the new epoch in the Church's life with our apostolic benediction. So we can, of course, examine some more of his audiences another time, where he talks about the importance of the vernacular and why there's a restoration of the vernacular to the Roman Rite. I think that might be a good topic for another day. So if y'all have any other suggestions, feel free to let me know them in the comment section. I'd be happy to take a look at them and consider them for an upcoming video. So certainly put them in the comments. Love to hear from you. And let me know what you thought about this video, if it was helpful for you and kind of understanding a little bit more the needs for the conciliar reforms to the liturgy. This is, again, by no means exhaustive. Much more can be said here, but this is just kind of a quick crash course. And hopefully it was productive to that end. Everybody hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. Also consider supporting me at patreon.com/Reason and Theology. You'll get access to extra material there that's exclusive to the patrons, and you will be supporting the show so that we can continue to offer you content that you appreciate. Good to see you, Father. He says, thanks as always. Great to see you. David says, thanks, Michael. I actually grew up not even knowing that Latin Mass existed. Well, that's kind of in some ways sad, because I want to say, look, we need to be able to appreciate all of the riches of the Church. And so I think it's good for us to be exposed to all of these different variations to the liturgy. But yeah, let's see what else we got real quick in the chat before I go. Haven't done a video on Mediator Day yet. Not yet, but I'm certainly open to it. Is Michael drinking from Kyle's mug? Yeah, he sent this to me. It's pretty epic. So Catholic Crusader says, I'll only go to a Novus Ordo Mass if there's no TLM parish when on vacation. Well, I'm glad that you still will go, but you might want to work on the question of the need for the conciliar reforms. That being said, there's nothing wrong with preferring a particular expression of the Roman Rite over another, as long as it's just merely a preference and it's not one of, I'm looking down on these other expressions. If you're looking down on them or you think they're deficient in some way, that's where some catechesis is needed. Okay. All right. Well, anyways, I hope that was helpful, everyone. Again, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. More to come, so stay tuned for more. We'll see you later. God bless. Hey, friends, do you want others to discover why the Catholic Church is the church that Jesus established? And do you want to help people make sense of all the confusion in the Catholic Church today? Help contribute to this mission by supporting Reason and Theology at patreon.com/Reason and Theology. By doing so, you'll also get access to exclusive content for patrons only. Also, if you want to deepen your faith, there are free ebooks and even courses that you can sign up for by visiting reason.podia.com.